Let me briefly introduce Alex, though you all know who he is. Author of From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth, which is about to be, or maybe it just has been, subject to a symposium in political theory.
A little while ago, yeah, sure.
Also editor of Politics Without Sovereignty, and has now finished his manuscript of Capital Personified, a political theory of the entrepreneur. And his website suggests that it's anybody who wants to comment, have at it. He'll be glad to give you a copy. Alex has written lots of articles, both in scholarly journals like the American Political Science Review, and in more topical journals like Jacobin and American Prospect. I won't go on and on. He has published widely and fascinatingly, if there's such a word. But I want to say just one more word about our good friend here, and that is the extent to which Alex inspires our grad students in a very specific way. That Alex's work is both incredibly precise, scholarly, but also he does his scholarly work without abandoning his commitments. And I think people who see your work are really inspired by that. That you don't have to check your values at your door just because you're going to be an impressive academic. So rather than just list article after article, I want to say how inspiring that is to your colleagues, young and old. And with that, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. That's my favorite introduction ever. I had no idea. It's good to know. Well, so today I am presenting two, basically, arguments drawn from two articles I published recently about universal basic income. And in particular, what I am presenting is my own personal reassessment of two left-wing arguments for a universal basic income that I once found compelling and over time fell out of love with. They were really, at one point, what I thought it meant to think as a left-wing philosopher, and now I find neither of them compelling. And the two arguments are, one is what we can call the pragmatic argument, which is that we should sort of prioritize a universal basic income as a policy goal in our left-wing politics and advocacy, because it can be a kind of stepping stone, a means to a broader emancipatory struggle by left-wing parties and working class constituencies. That's the pragmatic argument. And then the other argument is a utopian argument, which is that, and that's not meant to be critical of it, it's a principled utopian argument in the following sense. It's an argument that the UBI is the central policy idea of a vision of a post-work socialist community. And so it's not something we prioritize here and now, but it is instead understood to be something that helps articulate our vision, a vision, of a post-work emancipated socialist society. And what I want to do is suggest why I think both of them make a mistake, and they're sort of logically parallel mistakes in the following sense. They both presuppose the very thing that they say they're helping us skip over. The pragmatic one presupposes the politics, it says it's a means to, and the utopian one presupposes the necessary labor, it says it's emancipating us from. So to explain this view, let me first say a little bit about what a universal basic income is in this case. Then I'll present to you the pragmatic case, which I'll then try to show why I think it's a mistake. And then see why the attempt to rescue this by saying, no, let's take the utopian version is also a mistake. Okay, so both left-wing arguments are, I think, initially attractive because they see the universal basic income as having a value because of its connection to human freedom. So there are many arguments for universal basic income. There's like a Freudian symptomatic excess of arguments for universal basic income. So I'm not addressing all of them. I'm just addressing this batch of left-wing arguments. And what unites them is their sense that a universal basic income is emancipatory. It's an instrument of freedom. Freedom's the central value that explains its attraction. And also explains its content. Why? Because a universal basic income is supposed to provide everybody with an exit option. It provides them with an exit option in the sense that if you have a UBI, as it's called, then you can exit not just your current employment, but the entire labor market if you want to. You don't have to work at all. Now, in both the pragmatic and the utopian case for the UBI, this means the UBI has a very specific policy character and content. It means that it's universal in the sense that it's available to every member of the political unit, let's call it the nation state just for convenience. It's also universal in the sense that it's also unconditional, by which is meant everybody receives it not conditional upon working. Like a wage is income conditional on working for the wage, right? So it's unconditional that everyone gets it. You don't have to do anything for it, right? Or at least you don't have to work for it. There might be other conditions, but. And it's basic in the sense that it is of a sufficient level, it's enough income that you could meet all of your basic needs by it, right? And that's a very important feature of the UBI on the left. Now, on the left-wing version, there's one final element to it that is important. We'll see why it's important, especially important later, which is that the UBI is not meant to replace any of the universal in-kind entitlements of the welfare state. So you get this income, but it doesn't replace free public education, universal health care, and any of the other basic goods that are more efficiently and more properly provided through in-kind entitlements. So it's a complement. And so it's the bundle together that guarantees that everybody can meet their basic needs without working, and therefore has a true exit option from the labor market, right? The right-wing version wants to liquidate the welfare state into a UBI, and it's a way of actually socializing people into the market society. It doesn't provide them a full alternative. So this is a very important question, and this is why I'm not dealing with the right-wing argument. I'm talking about the left-wing argument, although the right-wing will. And this is meant to be descriptive terms. So if you attach positive value to right wing or left wing, don't do that. I'm just describing it. I don't think anybody objects to that as a. Okay, so the left wing argument, both the pragmatic and utopian one, says a universal basic income is just the income you get, not conditional on working, sufficient level that you can meet all of your basic needs. That's why it's emancipatory. Now, the pragmatic case, what I'm calling the pragmatic case, is the argument that this is a policy that the left, or people generally, should prioritize in their politics and advocacy because it can serve as a means to energizing left-wing politics, facilitating collective action, and generating the kinds of social dynamics that will allow for more expansive transformation of capitalist society. In the earliest formulation, it was called the capitalist road to communism. That's how Philip von Parijs described it, and that was just one version of it. And it's got some technical features that we don't have to worry about. But generally, it was this point: it's a means to individual and collective action that will transform society. And there's some plausibility to this claim. So, for instance, at the individual level, if everybody had a UBI, they would probably strike very different bargains with their employers. And just through these individual bargains, they would transform the character of their work, because people wouldn't put up with crappy bosses or shitty working conditions or low wages or, abuse and so on. But the core of the pragmatic argument, that was in a way von Parijs's argument, but the core of the pragmatic argument is really that if everybody has this exit option, then it will make it easier for workers to undertake the forms of collective action that are needed to transform capitalist society and engage in progressive social transformation. For instance, it's a permanent strike fund, right? If people strike because they want to change society, go on a political strike or an economic strike or general strike, they have an income to fall back on, which is not true in an ordinary situation, right? People, if they have a strike fund, they might have reduced pay. In some cases, you don't have any. So the pragmatic case is that it will facilitate this collective action and be a means to a more expansive militant working class or left-wing politics. And or likewise, they also think that unlike other left-wing policies that might be attractive, a UBI is also much more feasible. So the reason to prioritize is not just that it's a means to this kind of collective action, but it's also much more feasible because it doesn't involve the much more controversial and complex activities like socializing a part of the economy, bringing it directly under public control, creating some really complex, difficult new bureaucracy of the state. It's very easy to administer, while other conventional left-wing policies are much more complex and controversial. And so the reason for prioritizing it is not just that it is this sort of economic means, this permanent strike fund, but there's a reason to think it's more sort of politically feasible, win general agreement for the policy. Sounds plausible, but actually, I think the more we think about it, it's it's not just a little implausible as an argument, it's wildly implausible, and here's why. The problem is that the UBI that the pragmatic case describes involves such a massive transfer of income, such a massive redistribution of income and social power, that it will be intensely resisted by the wealthy and the business class. And so intensely resisted by the wealthy and the business class that the only conditions under which we would get it would be ones in which there is already a massive, highly disciplined, militant left-wing movement that is able to impose its will on those who resist it. And therefore, the pragmatic case presupposes the very thing it claims it is a means to. Why is this the case? Okay. Well, here's two reasons why I think that this is wrong. The first is the UBI that the pragmatic case imagines involves, on a conservative estimate, socializing an additional 20 to 25% of national GDP just in order to pay for it. So using a very conservative estimate of the poverty line, right? Remember, it's got to be UBI that you can meet all of your basic needs for. So using a very conservative estimate of the poverty line, 15,000 a year, you'd have to socialize 20 to 25% of additional income, which would put public spending in the United States above Scandinavian social democracies as a share of its GDP. No one's ever succeeded in doing this, except in wartime, right? And where is that money going to come from? It can't come from liquidating the welfare state, because that's the whole point of the left-wing version, is that you've got to cover all basic needs. You still need to have universal health care and public education alongside the UBI. And there isn't enough savings to come from, say, cash payments for welfare. That's just not going to save enough. Moreover, if we're going to finance it then, it has to come from taxing. So already it's a form of socialism. It's a massive socialization just of shares of GDP in the hands of the state, not of private actors. But more than that, the money would have to come from taxing the income and wealth of the top 20%. So you can't get enough just from the top 2 or 3%. I'm moving very quickly over very complex calculations. So some of this, you'll kind of have to trust me, but I can send you the article where we try to lay out all the possibilities, and we can talk about it in question and answer. But however you slice and dice it, for the state to be able to provide everybody with a UBI that they can use to buy their necessities, you'd have to get all of this 20 to 25% of the GDP from taxing the income and wealth of the top 20 to 25% of the population, top 20% of the population. That population is going to be very unwilling to have that amount of income and wealth taxed. Every public opinion poll we know of and every predictable sociological behavior, it's a practical fact. I think statistician talks about things being a practical reality, even if you could, or a practical fact, even if in principle we could imagine people behaving differently. It is just a practical fact. Top 20% will not accept those levels of taxation on their income and wealth without a fight. But that's not the only problem. The further problem is it's not just that they're going to be unwilling and unlikely to cooperate with a form of social policy like this that involves such a huge distribution of income and wealth from the top 20% to the bottom 80%. But also, it involves an immense shift in social power. And we know that because that's what the pragmatic case says, right? The whole point of a UBI is to suddenly give every person the freedom to simply quit their job without any profound cost to themselves. And we already have a very well-known piece of social theory that tells us why the business class is going to resist this, which is the famous essay by Mikhail Kalecki on political aspects of full employment, which, says, right, that even though full employment is beneficial to the employing classes because it will raise their profit rates, they always tend to resist state policies that do this because he gives 3 reasons. There are 2 that are most relevant to us. One is that they profoundly reject the idea that people should earn without working or be able to live without working. So they insist on the ideological power and on preserving that ideological power. But even more, they want to preserve the threat of the sack, as Kalecki said. And they will resist any policy that undermines their control over employment and the social power they get from being able to fire and threaten to fire their employees. But that is just the power that they will lose if you have a UBI. So both because of the enormous redistribution of wealth and because of the shift in social power that a UBI represents, we should expect not just some resistance, but immense, extremely violent, and highly organized resistance from the wealthy and the business class. Which is why there's no reason to think that this is going to be a feasible political policy that could be a first step to working class politics. Instead, we should think that the only circumstances under which we could expect to get this kind of a policy is when you already have an extremely militant, well-organized working class with its own political party that it can put into power and use to impose its will through the state on the business class so that it can extract all that wealth. But if that's true, then the pragmatic case presupposes the very thing it says it's a means to, right? It presupposes this mass working class politics that currently doesn't exist and isn't even in the offing, and which it can't be a means to. And which means even more, we should be very worried about people who just say, yes, I'm for a UBI, because the most feasible version of the UBI is going to be the right-wing one, which is the one that liquidates the welfare state into cash payments, which can be inflated away or whatever. And so one has to be very careful about even saying, yes, I think we should support a UBI here and now, because you have to make very careful and specific. You only support the left-wing one, which is the infeasible one, and not the feasible one, which is the Charles Murray, Milton Friedman, Mark Zuckerberg one, right? So, and which means probably you shouldn't say we should give any priority to it because people get confused. And there's many versions of this kind of mistake. We make it, I think we make it in many areas of social policy, from UBI to gun control. People think I'm for gun control because I'm in favor of taking guns out of the hands of white militias and school shooters. And what it actually means is you get a gun control policy that means police should hyper-police black and brown communities in the name of gun control. That's what stop and frisk was in New York. And people say, no, I wasn't for that. You say, well, you say you were for gun control. You didn't say which one. You didn't say why. You didn't say why you would only support one but not that one. Then the same thing goes for UBI. I think in particular UBI, because we're going to get the Mark Zuckerberg, Charles Murray, Jeff Bezos version of the UBI, which just liquidates the few remaining gains of back when there was a strong social democratic movement. So that's the problem, it seems to me, with the pragmatic case. So someone might say, and I once said this in print, mistakenly, okay, fine, you're right, we shouldn't make a pragmatic case for a UBI. But what if we see the UBI as a policy for a future socialist community? So it's not something to be given priority here and now. It's not something that we should prioritize in our politics here and now. No, what we should do is use it, describe it as part of a socialist society, so that we could describe what a future society based on real human freedom would look like. And then we can hold that up as a kind of ideal that explains why it's worth engaging in left-wing politics and inspiring people to engage in struggle. And because it would serve as a useful way of freeing people in a future society from oppressive democratic decisions of a socialist community. And as I said, I once thought this, I thought it was a way of saving what I like about the UBI, but I don't even think that's true. And, or at least, I don't know if it makes any sense, and here's why. So, you might say, okay, the the way we can sort of recover the attachment to freedom that the left has and express it is by saying a future socialist society is a post-work society. It's a post-work society in the sense that nobody is forced to work and everybody enjoys ample free time. And that's the central point that we want to hold on to, and what's supposed to distinguish a socialist society as a community of freedom from the capitalist one, in which a large majority of people are forced to work at whatever job they can find, while many people aren't forced to work at all. That's sort of, simply put, one of the central conflicts between the left and the right, and when they're arguing about freedom. And the great thing about a UBI in this case is that it provides a very simple policy ideal for presenting a picture of what a future emancipated society would be like. Because not only in this future society would we be able to, would nobody be forced to work, but it would allow us to also raise a certain point, engage in a kind of culture war about the meaning of freedom itself, and in particular our attachment to work. Because what the post-work socialists say is, yes, it's true that a UBI is counter-normative. It's true that many people think, oh, should really everyone be able to meet all of their needs without working? And they want to say, yes, we want to get at that idea, because the real point of socialism is to attack the work ethic itself. A truly free society is a post-work society, not just in the fact that as an institutional fact, everybody would be free to meet their basic needs without having to work. It would also be one in which there is no work ethic at all. Why is that the case? I'm just checking my time to make sure I'm not rambling on. Okay. The reason is this. They say, look, for us to have truly free time, it's not enough that we feel no economic compulsion to work. It has to also be the case that we aren't ostracized, stigmatized, dishonored, or otherwise socially excluded for not working. But in a society based on the work ethic, where everybody finds their place in society, finds their partners and friends in society, finds their standing in society by working, and only if they work, then people will be under such immense pressure to work that they won't really enjoy free time, even if they have a UBI alone. Because they won't be free to use their time as they see fit. The whole ideal, the whole post-work socialist idea of a truly free society is one in which we are really free to use our time however we see fit. That's the great thing of the UBI, but it can only do that if it goes hand in hand with extinguishing the work ethic, right? In the sense of extinguishing any broad-based, deep social and cultural pressure to be useful, be productive, contribute. Only then will we be free to use our time just to enjoy each other's company, to engage in play, to free love, experiments in sex and habits of life, and all whatever truly free time is about, right? The kind of, which is in one sense a very long-standing, certain version of a left-wing ideal. And it's precisely that kind of enjoyment of ourselves and each other that contemporary society really deprives people. And so this is why this post-work emancipated society can't just, or finds so much meaning, or that these socialists, and I'm dispensing with all the names and the quotations for purposes of time, but I can refer you to the people who say this. I'm not making it up. It's actually a very common argument, a very fashionable argument on the left, amongst the kind of more radical left, about what socialism is and should be about. So it's not just it's not just me arguing with myself or something like that. So in fact, post-work socialism is probably the most dynamic, active, popular form of socialism right now in terms of producing bodies of scholarship and philosophy and histories and stuff like that. So what they find in the UBI is not just a policy, but a whole ideal of society, right? It's one in which everyone has this UBI and there's no work ethic. The problem is, the minute you ask how a UBI is supposed to work in this society, it turns out it presupposes the very thing it says it's getting rid of. And the reason is this: a UBI can only be emancipating for each individual if you can use your income to buy things. And it only works if you don't have to work, order to be able to acquire your basic goods. So it means that there already has to be available a bunch of goods that you can buy, and not just any goods, right? It's no good if it's like watches, AirPods, and tennis balls. It's got to be basic goods. And it's not just got to be basic goods, it has to be enough basic goods in enough quantities that everyone can buy them without inflating away the value of their basic income. And that's not even enough. It's got to be enough basic goods, not just available today, but tomorrow and in the future, which means that not only do we have to produce basic goods, there has to be the production of all the raw materials and all of the industrial capacity to continue producing those basic goods in agriculture, transportation, industry, and so on, such that they're permanently available for purchase by the UBI. If any of those conditions fail, then the UBI can't be emancipatory because you can't use it to buy your basic goods, and you've got to find some other way of acquiring your basic goods. But what that means is, it presupposes somebody's producing those goods. So the UBI presupposes the necessary labor that it says it emancipates us from, because it can only be emancipatory conditional on a lot of people somewhere, at some point, and continuously over time, producing basic goods. And in fact, it has to presuppose a lot when it says that there's a problem of necessary labor. The post-work socialist society has to presuppose, in particular, a solution to the problem of necessary labor in two senses. It has to presuppose first that some agents somewhere have identified what counts as basic goods, how to produce them, what the necessary tasks are that somebody has to perform, and that those roles are publicly known and available for people to occupy. So that's first sense. So there's a social, political, institutional problem that it has to solve that it doesn't explain to us how it's going to solve. And secondly, it has to assume that there is appropriate labor supply so that people are actually going to show up and do the jobs producing the basic goods. And the problem is, at best, the post-work argument, this utopian argument for a UBI, is ambiguous about its solution to that problem. Because it says, look, what we can do is we can give everyone a UBI and just remain indifferent to what they do with it, right? That's the sense in which this is an emancipated society. But obviously we can't remain indifferent to what people do with it, because what if nobody takes any time to figure out what it takes to produce necessary goods? Within a month, the UBI is not emancipatory, it's a useless bunch of paper, right? I think, though, the problem is worse. It's not just that it's ambiguous. We have good reason to think that the post-work vision provides us with a self-contradictory vision. And for the reason is that it gives us no reason to think that there will be an adequate labor supply available of people willing to undertake necessary tasks. So at minimum, it gives us no reason to think that there will be enough people willing to do necessary tasks, because the whole point is a post-work society has eliminated all of the inducements to get people to do it. It's not just that it gave people a UBI, it also is based on attacking the very idea that people have any good reason at all for wanting to do their part. Right? It's an attack on the very idea of a work ethic. No work ethic is consistent, on their view, with a post-work, properly emancipated society, because the very idea of there being social pressure on people to do their part or to work in any capacity is considered to be anathema to the idea of truly being free to use your time as you see fit. So we have good reason to think not only that it's pretty unclear and a very contingent matter as to whether even the basic goods will be produced, but to think that they won't be, unless we engage in a huge contradiction, right? Which is that everybody still somehow feels some reason to contribute their abilities and talents. It seems to me that for a UBI to be emancipatory, to really fill out this vision, you have to say instead that it only works if there is a broad-based willingness of people not just to contribute their talents and abilities, but in fact a broad-based and spontaneous willingness of people to do necessary labor, which anyhow is usually precisely the kinds of labor that UBI proponents point out most people are unwilling to do, right? That's the kind of labor nobody wants to do. Go watch a video of cabbage picking. You know, I've picked straw. I've worked on farms doing strawberry picking. It sucks. Yeah. I don't know why anybody would do it if they weren't forced to do it, right? I'm not advocating we should force people to do it. I'm saying that if we want to come up with a vision of social freedom in which nobody is forced to work, the only reasonable answer, it seems to me, is not to attack the work ethic, but to give an account of the conditions under which it would be reasonable to ask everyone to do their share of the necessary labor, such that nobody would have to be forced to do it. But that's just the kind of question that the utopian proponents of the UBI want to reject, because they think that is unacceptable compulsion or coercion of people, because the work ethic itself is incompatible with the enjoyment of free time. So my last thought then is, is the reason I think this is important, it's important to notice this feature of the mistake that the utopian argument makes, is that all the post-work socialists tend to think that the work ethic is just a form of capitalist ideology. That it's just there to induce the working class to spontaneously comply with its own exploitation, and it has no reasonable basis. And that therefore, anytime anyone anywhere says, well, you should get a job, or it's reasonable to get a job, or everyone should do their part, that's just seen as ideological expectation in the mouths of the people saying it. And I'm inclined to think it's the opposite. To the degree that capitalist ideology does work to get people to spontaneously comply with their own exploitation, it's because there's something extremely reasonable about people thinking everyone should do their part. And that is it's good and a good thing that people think that. The problem is our institutions do not, in fact, try to induce everybody to do their part. It exempts some people from having to do anything and forces many other people to do way too much. And that instead, and so that the mistake the left does is it self-marginalizes by presenting itself as these sort of radical critics of the work ethic without being able to extract anything reasonable and recognize what's reasonable and perhaps even emancipatory about a thought that is there in the work ethic, which is that everyone should do their part and nobody should be institutionally exempted from it. So there's something politically significant about this that matters for how we think about different ways of arguing for the UBI. That goes beyond just contemplating, castles in the sky and future utopias. So those are my two arguments. Those are my concerns with both the pragmatic and the utopian case for the UBI. I wanted to distinguish them because it's very hard sometimes when we talk about a UBI to know which argument anyone's talking about and which version, which policy. So it's also worth just, I think, getting it clear. It was never that clear in my mind, so I'm not accusing others of being, I'm not presenting myself as the clear-headed person in a room full of cloudy-minded people. It's that I think it's worth, because then we can see what the stakes are depending upon which version of the argument we're considering.
Sure. All right, the floor is open for questions. So do I need to leap in? Sure. So let's start with that last note. It's reasonable for everyone to do their part. How does that happen? How does that happen in a just society? So to leap beyond the problems and begin to help us think what we want, what you want now.
So are you saying, which part are you asking about? How does that happen? How does that culture of shared labor emerge?
How should someone committed to social justice think about making everyone or fostering an idea that everyone does their just part and not more?
Yeah.
What's the vision look like?
I guess the way I would imagine it working is that a future society would be one in which it was public knowledge that there are necessary tasks that have to be done. It would be general public knowledge the range of those tasks, what they might be, and some institutions for sharing them, so everybody could do their share. And then there would be broad-based social expectations that people do one or some of these tasks. So I think it would probably mean there would be a decent amount of social pressure, beginning with beginning with like primary school education. That cultures only exist and become. I kind of follow Weber in what an ethic is. I think an ethic isn't just ideas people have in their mind about how they ought to behave. They are broadly based set of cultural norms that explain consistent patterns of behavior over time. The Protestant ethic only becomes the ethic when a large number of people hold to this idea for the same reason, and that determines the structure of their behavior, right? So there would be a work ethic, and it would be established and maintained through institutions and social norms. But it also means that there would be real forms of social pressure on people to do it. So the question, it seems to me, is whether that would mean we're still kind of coercing or force people to do it. And I think that we would not be, in at least one sense, which is that people do things freely when they're doing them for reasons that are really theirs. Right? So the problem with capitalist society is it's true that everybody ought to do their share. It's just that our institutions are set up such that nobody can do it, because some people just do way too much in order to do anything at all, and others don't have to do anything. In which case, the post-work socialists are correct when they say, well, when people then go and work and do so and think they're doing so out of duty, they're kind of getting exploited. It's true, because the roles available to people don't allow it to be a reason for them. But if you actually had a way of sharing necessary tasks fairly, then when people do it out of a sense of duty, that's really a reason that they have, given the fairness of the distribution of roles. So just because there's then a pressure around it that everybody feels, that's what's going to happen whenever we have normative behavior. So that's why some people will, for a time, I'm sure, feel like they kind of got no other choice and they see no inner reason they have for doing that activity. But I don't think that means they couldn't still be doing it freely.
Yeah, so people would pick strawberries locally and just enough for them in their neighborhood.
Some tasks it would be available to the community to decide that some needs should not be considered needs because the labor required to satisfy them is too burdensome.
Yeah, want them grow your own.
Grow your own if you really want strawberries. Maybe there wouldn't be strawberries. I think there also maybe wouldn't be like private dog walkers. There might not be people who spend all their day painting other people's nails. Like I can think of a lot of tasks that might disappear because they only exist because we can force people to do them. Like I buy these delicious blueberries every week from my store. They're really good, but I do wonder if, I'm enjoying a capitalist luxury. They might not be, actually I've picked blueberries. They're not that hard to pick. But they probably even could,
they're easy to grow.
But strawberries, I don't know, maybe we would eat a lot less strawberries because it would be available to us to say, not worth it to make anybody do this. This doesn't count as something that we consider necessary. If, after everyone having done what their necessary share, they still want to commit their lives to growing strawberries, then strawberries will be available to some people. But even that introduces another problem, but I don't want to get about what we decide is necessary labor.
Yeah. I mean, it was very interesting. I liked it very much, what you said. And I mean, what you now explained was that we need at least some sanctions to enforce necessary labor. That means a kind of internalized, on this way or that way, in a liberal way, but a kind of disciplinary society. So, there's two questions. Or 2 points. The one is that kind of disciplinary identity, disciplinary subject, like that of Max Weber. Is that imaginable without a class society? And the second is there are examples for that kind of societies, that these are Archivarian, egalitarian societies, as Christopher Böhm has analyzed them, with these anti-hierarchy, anti-dominance hierarchy. Yeah. So that they have a strict normative system. Yeah, that is based on strict egalitarianism. And is enforced by a relatively moderate system of sanctions. Yeah, and this works, but it works at least in small hunter-gatherer societies. Yeah. But how could it work in an industrial society without constituting a class society? That is the question.
Yeah.
So.
So I think that it probably would, in one sense, be a disciplinary society, if I understand what you mean by that, which is that there would be various mechanisms of cultural control that would establish norms for what's normative behavior and non-normative behavior. That people would then aspire to, or if they fail to behave that way, would be considered deviant. And I don't have a problem with that. I think that Foucault generated a kind of moral panic about normative behavior itself that then attacked the very idea of human freedom as anything but just, it turned human freedom into anti-normative choice, which anyhow then is why he backed himself into a neoliberal world. Never intending to, but every theoretical step he took was like facing the left. He took every step backwards and then found himself in the room with no freedom. So that's because once you take on the idea that normative behavior itself is a form of control from which individuals need to be emancipated, you're left with nothing but market behavior. Because you just have choice of unobstructed choice about your preferences, whatever they are. So I don't think there's any conflict between human freedom and normative behavior, and I think the only way we learn what it is to do things as moral agents who have reasons that they ought to behave, rather than as just animals with desires who behave like billiards on a billiard table. That's a mixed metaphor, but billiard, the economist billiard ball, balls on a billiard table or animals just externally determined. It only works if we're socialized into the practice of behaving normatively. And so I think that, to me, that's the difference between the fact that this society would be disciplinary. To me, in this way, I'm sort of more paleo-leftist, in that I think the problem is not between the disciplinary and non-disciplinary society, but discipline and ideology, which is whether the norms into which we're socialized are in fact norms of society that are worth and that have command on our reason. And the problem with the work ethic is, in the capitalist society, is precisely that conflict between the normative expectation that people work and institutions which distribute that burden in a wildly anti-normative way. So that's my sense. I'm willing to accept it would be disciplinary in that sense, but it would be norms that it would be worth consciously and positively upholding. That, I don't know if that responds yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question goes a little bit in another direction. I mean, I think it's very clear that the redistribution only of money and wealth would not do so much. So it wouldn't change the system, so to say. So you suggest that we should do a redistribution of work. And so, I mean, I take it also, you can do it in a pragmatic sense and a utopian. So utopian would be definitely to get rid of capitalism, because as we know, labor is not free. So you have first to free labor from the labor market, from the owners and the capital who will buy labor and so, and also the production machinery. So I wonder what is the role of technology in your model, because it looks like, so the strawberries, I think, is a very, cute example for this, and it's too cute. I mean, because basically what we are speaking here about, I think, is industrial work, and not only just, the rural work. So to reorganize an industrial plant, so I think we should then look for models where this was probed. I mean, when you think in the 70s, in the car industry in Sweden, they tried to get into more, autonomous forms of production planning and so. So this goes more for kind of participation, and so I'm not so sure what kind of political model you have in mind, in which this redistribution of work should take place. It's there where it's a production, so should we revolutionize productions? I'm totally in favor of this, but I think the consequences are much more utopian than the idea that you just distribute money because this you can print.
So I agree with you. Once I came to this view, I became very disappointed with myself because what it means is that if we're going to be serious about what the alternative to the present looks like, we can't allow ourselves the comfort of these sort of like easy, ready to hand, not so complex policy proposals. Just give everybody UBI and let things rip and see what happens. That's all I mean, sort of, look, it's not so bad. The future study is just one in which everybody gets a UBI and we'll automate away all the hard work. I liked that. I used to really love that as a view. But if we take it seriously, the problem of necessary labor seriously, it involves a much more substantial collective commitment to take responsibility for the organization of production. And that's a lot harder. It's a lot more complex, a lot more politically distant. But if we're going to be, I guess my feeling about it is you have to be honest with yourself about really the kind of society you're talking about. So it's not emancipating people from the means of production. It means we have to take collective responsibility for organizing and planning it. Right? That's the kind of seduction, I think, of the post-work view, is that it allows us to avoid all those questions, right? That, look, we just give everybody a basic income and we don't have to worry about these complicated questions. What people want to do, they do freely, right? Because they had an alternative to doing it, and it's all copacetic. That's not, I don't think it's freedom. I think that's a kind of false image of it. It does raise institutional questions about what does a democratic form of planning look like? What does it look like for people to even want to have the collective responsibility for determining what human needs are going to count properly as basic, such that we want people to work for them, versus what needs are simply going to be luxuries, such that if nobody's willing to do that task, it's not a social problem, but people can do it with all of their leftover free time. But I think it's actually a more serious, complex problem people want to say. That's just preamble. I will say, though, that I think institutionally, I have been reading a lot about socialist calculation debates because I think that's the closest we ever got to an image of a democratically planned economy. And it's one in which it isn't merely through the institutions of the state, but where every workplace is itself democratically governed. Because there are many decisions that can't be taken in a properly democratic way at the level of the state as a whole. And, I think the closest we got to an institutional vision of this was probably Polanyi's early writings, which he talks about a society where you have organizations of workers, organizations of consumers, and a democratic national state, deliberating collectively and continuously about, on the one hand, what needs really count as basic needs, and on the other, about the conditions under which it's reasonable to demand people to work. But I think that, to me, actually, the thing that would probably be hardest for people to accept is a way of relating to their own preferences as needs, because we have to accept the political negotiation of need. Our society just presents our preferences as given and non-negotiable facts about us that nobody gets to have a say about, and it's a violation of our freedom that anyone should question whether it deserves satisfaction. But once we recognize that we can only satisfy our needs if someone else does labor to satisfy it, then I think that presents the democratic problem, which is, well, on what terms do we demand and ask for the labor of others? That means it's got to be politically negotiated, and we have the institutions that negotiate it. And that's what I like about the Polanyi vision of it, and why it wouldn't just be workplace democracy plus national democracy. I think the reason he thought, on the one hand, you would have large organizations of essentially consumers, is that's the form in which as human beings we'd articulate what we say, understand to be needs. But because we would all also be workers, because every able-bodied adult would be expected to contribute their labor, we'd be negotiating with ourselves, is the thought, right? Because just in the other sense in which we're part of society, rather than two classes, right? Consumers versus producers, or owners versus, right?
Yeah.
We sort of have, it would be just different articulations of the same self negotiating with itself collectively. I don't know what the outcome would be, because I have no idea, but I think that's the institution. There was somebody back there.
Yeah, I'd like to start out by remembering John Romer's book, Free to Lose.
Yeah.
Because I don't think social democracy focuses on freedom per se. It focuses on freedom with equality and equity. And I think that this is Rhode Island, all right? Rhode Island has 26 fucking school districts. They're not equal. They're based on property, all right? People lose. If you're born in Central Falls or Providence, you lose.
Yeah.
If you're born in East Greenwich or Barrington, you win, all right? And if there's more property, you go to Brown, all right? So I just find that when people talk about universal basic income, I'm a professor. I teach at a state university. I went to Brooklyn College in the 60s when it was free. Okay, it was free. All right, that was social democracy. All right, and you had a choice. You had an opportunity to get in. There were standards. All right. When people are talking about basic income, they're not talking about these abstract economic models of Kalecki, et cetera. What they're talking about is Oakland has tried basic income, all right? And they're trying it now. And when I woke up this morning, I was reading the New Statesman, and what I was reading was that the universal credit in Britain, not enough people don't have enough to buy food and to heat their houses. All right? Now, what I don't understand is why are you looking at basic income with this idealist sense of what is freedom and happiness, as opposed to the fact that people are suffering? And what social democracy? I don't want to get into utopian socialism, which is where you're at. You're not talking about Marx now. You're not talking about.
Okay, I think we got the question.
Yeah,
It's a challenge. The gauntlet has been thrown.
I think
let's let him answer.
The point is that I think that the issue of basic income is not about post-work. It's about the fact that people will not find work.
Yeah. So this is absolutely true, that one of the other arguments people make, there's two classes of arguments which I didn't directly address about why basic income is good. One is it's just the best form of poverty alleviation. Some people say that. And that's not a particularly left-wing argument. It's sort of a kind of an argument that's made by liberals, by progressives, by some conservatives, right? And some people attach it to a claim about the present, which is that automation and the economy has put people out of work without it being possible to find work for them. And so the real function then of universal basic income is not that it frees people or emancipates people, not even the pragmatic argument that I mentioned, which is that it's a stepping stone to a more dramatic transformation of the economy, but that it's just a way of softening the blow of our of our highly unequal, high technology society that's automated industrial labor and can't find any other form of employment for people. Right? That might be an argument for it. It doesn't strike me as a very compelling argument for it, and it's not an argument for the UBI that I described. Right? The UBI I described is a UBI that is sufficiently large to meet everybody's basic needs, to actually eliminate their poverty. There's no such experiment anywhere of that sort. They're all small-scale, partial basic incomes that presuppose the partial and small scale of those things. And in fact, what they do is they presuppose that somebody somewhere else is doing the labor to produce the goods that the people with the basic incomes are buying. So Manitoba did this on the provincial level. And then people look at Manitoba and say, look, it worked, it's great. In fact, employment levels went up a little bit, blah, blah, blah. There was no major loss in employment. Yeah, because the people in Manitoba were buying goods that were produced in China, right? If we're talking about an actual policy for a whole nation state, then all of these little experiments are meaningless because partial equilibriums tell us nothing about general equilibriums. And all the stuff I said about the resistance you're going to get, the minute you propose it at the national scale, all kicks in. So yes, it would be great if everybody who is poor wasn't poor. But the only conditions under which they're not going to be poor is if you have, I am being a Marxist, unlike you. The only conditions under which you're going to be able to do that is when you can actually challenge the class power of the people who guarantee that the people who are put out of work end up being out of work and poor. For that, you need a mass militant working class movement, not a policy idea that sounds good. So that's my response to that. I don't think it's very persuasive at the partial level.
But I think you're still just regarding the issue of inequality and property, all right? And I think,
That's the
I'm
whole
sorry,
game of the
yes, it is the whole ball game, all right? And
Let me stop you, and you guys can continue this after the lecture. I want to get the rest of the questions in, and if there's time afterwards, we can go back. But Margaret has been waving her hand desolately.
Not really. I just wanted to say one or two things. One is, and you just got to it, which is, the experiments that are out there are just income supports, and they're not
Yes.
universal,
Yes.
right? They're income targeted.
Right.
And they've had, positive results because somebody can buy a car and get a better
Sure.
job or, So, one question is, what do you think about doing those at a broader level? Some kind of, not universal. And I guess, what are the issues when you go to scale on that? And what would you, all the landlords in those areas could just raise their rents is one possibility. And also, do you end up with is it like Speenamlet? Because, it's super popular now.
Yeah.
Everybody, a lot of cities have versions of them. And kind of think it's great in a way, but I kind of think you can't go to scale with them.
Yeah.
And I guess I have one other question is, why doesn't the left care about social democracy anymore? Because as you were talking, I kept thinking about S.B. Anderson and decommodification.
Yeah.
And that's what decommodification was about. You build this welfare state and
Yeah.
you have to work, but you're also free. It's a
Yeah.
contradictory. You're also free from work in some ways. And, and then you had this description, you just wave your wand and you've got the UBI and all that question of how you set things up or gone. And is it that, or is it that the promise of social democracy seems to be fading, and so we want something more dramatic?
I think, there's a lot of different questions. Social democracy seems to have been defeated in the 20th century, and the UBI has been one way for the left to hold on to certain features of it that they liked, like decommodification. So S.B. Anderson is now a gateway drug to UBI for some people because they read it and they say the welfare state was decommodifying. That sounds good. Hey, let's decommodify labor completely by giving them a UBI. People do it. They say that. I know some of my best friends are, not best, I'm just exaggerating, but it's true that they see the decommodification and don't understand that decommodification was not just a point for social democrats and for S.B. Anderson about being able to meet your needs without working, but to be taking certain essential goods out of the market and and making them available to people not on the basis of their ability to buy them. So decommodification was a feature not of the person, just of the person, but of the commodity. And UBI is not decommodifying in that way. That's why Charles Murray likes it. He just says it. What I like about this is it will teach people to be more responsible participants in the market. Give them a monthly income. At the beginning, they'll misuse it, they'll abuse it. They'll come to learn how to spend and save their money responsibly, and they'll become socialized into economically rational market behavior, right? But his point is it's commodifying in that sense. So I think as people misread Esming Anderson even on this. The point is to make things available to people without market participation. So that's how I see people shaking their heads, but that's how I've always read his point. But anyway, that's at least a contestable thing. The other thing about social democracy is where you see cash transfers being most successful globally is precisely where welfare states were weak. So actually UBI experiments and other cash transfer experiments have been far more successful in the global south, where you didn't have developed welfare states distributing goods in kind. South Africa, India, Brazil, all these places. It's the closest you get to these things is actually places where you don't have to disintegrate or dissolve an already existing welfare state, which has attached interest groups and gains people want to preserve. So I do think that it's a reflection of the defeat of broader sense of alternatives. As for the experiments, I do think there's a chance it gets being handled. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's some kind of pilot UBI, and you can already tell that what's going to happen is people will stay there, right? It's going to be exactly like in China, where all of the welfare system is provincially based, and you have to be registered and living there. So people leave for a period of time. They go work as as undocumented workers inside their own country. Then they have to go back to their province to get married because they don't have healthcare coverage or any of their social benefits unless they go back. So China is modern Speenhamland, and we're just kind of making our. This would make us just like that, unless you had it properly universal at the nation state level, right? Or you'd have to provincially exclude people from coming, right? So like there's people who want to move. There's people who want to move from Somerville to Cambridge. Now people want to go to the fine spots in public housing because there is available to them the possibility of winning one of these small like lottery tickets for their pilot UBI program. So I think all the stuff we get from these experiments is very deceptive, I think, about the economic consequences, the general equilibrium effects if we did it at a society-wide scale. But even putting all that stuff aside, it's just deceptive about the politics required. Because Cambridge is like, Cambridge is like the United States, the way a vacuum cleaner is like an apple. It's not, such a weird particular place that you get benevolent, high-minded liberals who are willing to, depart with a small amount of income, negligible amount of income, to do this thing. But at the national level, we're talking about the top 20% giving up huge amounts of income and wealth out of the goodness of their heart. I just don't see it. I think it would require massive political struggle. That's the primary task.
Yes.
Thanks, Alex. I guess I'm curious about this aspect of norms, and we talked about a little bit whether they are coercive, or like how you can be free in the context of norms. Because you said, we would choose to follow these norms, but I think part of norms are also that they operate almost at an unconscious level, right? So even if we set them, maybe we set them up consciously, but then at some point we're sort of unconsciously operating. So I'm wondering how you think through that.
I take it this is a version of a disciplinary society has normative standards of behavior that it establishes not merely through the conscious enforcement of those norms, but through all of its daily behaviors, because that behavior becomes second nature. What is Hegel said, like our second nature becomes first nature. It's just how we behave, and we instantly communicate in our behavior what is normative and what's non-normative. And You know, I don't know, I go back and forth on this. I think that it would probably, to some, for some period of time, just seem coercive, right? I have children. They don't really understand the reasons I have for wanting them to behave certain ways. I make it very clear that it's normatively expected, but to get them to comply, sometimes I, coerce them into complying. But if they're always coerced in complying, then it's not normative behavior. That's the challenge with normative behavior is that you're only complying with normative behavior as normative behavior if you're not doing it for instrumental reasons. So there must be coercion to establish, to get people to behave at first, right? But if it is only enforced through the external instrumental considerations, then it has failed as a disciplinary society enforcing its norms qua norms. It's just behavior you're getting people to comply with. So like that's always like, as when I try to get my children to comply, my wife and I are always like, no, we have to tell them they ought to do this. And what they should most not want to face is our disappointment that they're not doing it, right? Because if it's always, well, you wanted to watch, then they're not complying with norms, they're just obeying our commands. So there will always be coercion insofar as people don't want to lose the respect and status and standing they have in a society, in any disciplinary society, and that will be communicated unconsciously often, right? People in culture and so on. But I think that is proper to normative behavior, that the disapproval, that's just internal to what it is to behave according to norms. So I don't know if that means, I'm not sure how if that addressed your concern or.
Yeah, so norms aren't bad, they aren't bad, they're sometimes coercive, not always though, and therefore we can be free.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of, there are always sanctions attached to failing to comply with norms. The question is whether those sanctions, and we might think some of those sanctions are like public disapproval, ostracism, and so you might say, well, it's just coercive like any other set of coercion. So what's the difference? And I guess I'd say that those sanctions are connected to, are internal to what it is to behave in a normative way. And so they don't violate the sense in which what you're saying, they alert you to the sense in which this is normative behavior, not just stuff I want to get you to do. So I think to me that's the difference. And so it would be a highly normative disciplinary society because all the other ways of getting people to behave wouldn't be there. That's the idea. To me.
Well, great. I think we're out of time. We can, want to sneak one last question in? Okay, well then join me in, yes, well, one last question, just a minute.
Yeah, I mean, the question of complexity, complex society.
Yeah.
I mean, complex society has different kinds of differentiation that it uses. In a very simple evolutionary model, we have segmentary societies, hierarchical societies, or certified societies, and class societies, and functional differentiation. Functional differentiation is unavoidable for a good life and a good society.
Yeah.
And this is Marx.
Yeah.
Just on this, you need the level of capitalism. But then, in this model of functional differentiation, there's needed for some hierarchy. And there's also need for segmentary societies like this one. This is an egalitarian society. And the university is already an example that is built on flat hierarchies and all that. Without administration. The administration is differentiated from it. With this stronger hierarchy. So, and you need also some positions which are better paid. So there is implied in this, also in your model of basic income, which I would prefer, or which I would support strongly, but you need some Anreize, incentives,
Incentives, yeah.
and
Would you? So,
but most of this work,
Yeah.
is work that people do like to do. Yeah, so that is
Yeah.
also an important thing. Yeah, that is so we would not, without work we could not live.
Yeah.
That's a
So,
problem.
I guess
So,
I agree.
but you need a mix of these three differentiation models. Yeah.
I guess I agree with you that any complex society like ours and a future utopian one would have to have a division of labor.
Yeah.
No question to me about that. And that would mean that even just in the category of like necessary tasks, there would some people who would perform some of those tasks in a specialized role, nurses, teachers, or whatever. That would just be how they would do necessary labor. Other kinds of labor wouldn't necessarily be all that complex, but some people would do it, but such that nobody has to spend too much of their time doing burdensome, unattractive, undesirable tasks. So in that sense, the contemporary division of labor wouldn't exist, because although there would be a division of tasks, I don't think you would have a division of roles in the way that our class society does, right? So that's what I think
It can be
indicates.
all changed.
To me, the real question
You
is
need
sort of,
some.
to me, the point though is, so I absolutely agree, I think there'd be a large degree of specialization division of labor. But to me, the utopian question and the interest I have in the kind of normative stuff would be, if you're allowing yourself to really be utopian, I don't know that you would need incentives. So we're really gonna say the point is you live in a society in which people do their fair share of what they ought to do, and everybody simply wishes to produce for the sake of contributing to the well-being and freedom of others. I don't know why you'd need any further incentive than doing your part in the production of that community, because it's just normative. You don't necessarily do it out of pure pleasure. Some of the stuff you do out of just a sense of duty. We do it for each other. I might not want to do my day of trash collection this month, but I'm going to do it. I might not enjoy it that much, although it's probably not nearly as burdensome and crappy now that it isn't for some bullshit neoliberal privatized company that the city outsourced it to, and it's not my whole life, right? But it's reasonable to think people would do it out of duty, or in some cases just out of the desire to be a teacher or a nurse or a doctor. Right? So I'm willing to say that at least from the pure form of from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs is one that doesn't require incentives, because the incentive is just to be in a position to do it. Very hard. I mean, I can't fully get I say it without necessarily being able to fully imagine the kinds of people that would do it, but choose to be parents. What's that?
Some reputation.
Is it reputation?
Incentive.
Also, there are some grounds, people choose to be parents. A lot of times, that's not the most fulfilling thing at certain moments. Other times, it is immensely fulfilling. So, and you do it not for the returns and incentives.
Yeah.
Go to
Not for
war,
money.
be parents, all these things.
People go into the military.
Yeah, which is pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
All right, well, join me in thanking Alex. Very